Adrian Goldberg. I'm the editor of the Byline podcast. I'm joined by the Byline Times executive editor, Peter Jukes, and the Byline Times political editor, Adam Bienkov. Reform, perform at the ballot box. Farage's party won a parliamentary by-election in Runcorn and Helsby. They have taken overall control of 4 local authorities at the time of recording. That's Durham, Staffordshire, Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire. In fact, that's 5, Derbyshire as well. And also their first mayoral election in Greater Lincolnshire. Overall, they have won 465 council seats in England. That's from a standing start. The Lib Dems, at the time of recording, have won 79 and the Greens 25. The biggest losers are the Tories. It is bad for Badenoch. They're down 429 council seats. Labour are down by 118. I'm just going to try and mute myself on a laptop that I have here. I think I've successfully done that. So that's the scenario. And of course, Adam, the right-wing press, the mainstream press will be painting this as very much a defeat, a bloody nose for Keir Starmer. It's not good for Labour. It's far, far worse for the Conservatives.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
mean, watching most of the coverage, it has focused on how bad these results are for the Labour Party. And, we shouldn't beat around the bush. They are bad results for the Labour Party. You can't lose one of your safest by-election parliamentary seats in the country and not be seen as a bad night for the party. But, to put this into context, going into these elections, the Conservatives held almost 2/3 of the seats that are up for contention. These are real Conservative heartland seats. And not only have they failed to win, or on course to failing to win the majority of the seats in these elections, it's looking like they're not even likely to be in second place. It looks like the Lib Dems are going to put them into third place. So this is pretty extraordinary for any opposition party, let alone at a time when they've just gone back into opposition. And when you've got an unpopular Labour government doing unpopular things, you really would expect the Conservatives, if not to be progressing from the point, because the last time these elections were held in these seats was at a high for Boris Johnson, to at least to be holding their ground to some extent. But we're seeing a complete collapse of the Conservative Party, actually going backwards compared to where they were at the last general election, which in itself was the worst election defeat that the Conservatives have suffered since their creation. So, of course, it's a story that Labour Party are not doing well in these elections. But the fact that the Conservative Party, which is historically been not just the most successful party in the UK, but also in Europe, the electorally successful party, the fact that they're going backwards so badly and suffering so badly in these elections is surely a much bigger story than how Labour are doing 4 years out from the next general election.
A little earlier, Peter, I heard James O'Brien giving a good skewering to Farage on LBC and a litany of the failures with which Farage has been associated, the most obvious of which is Brexit, which has brought difficult economic times to our country and fractured our relationships with our closest trading neighbours. He is, of course, historically at least, very favourable towards Putin. None of these things seem to affect him amongst his base. A bit like Trump, really. It almost doesn't seem to matter what he does. It's what he represents that is important to the people who offer him support.
The Trump analogy is very good. I mean, the other thing he did say was that Liz Truss was a fantastic prime minister and that was the best budget ever. And, well, partly this, he is the protest vote. He is he's actually in Parliament after all these years, but there is a sense, which is weird since he was a commodities trader and quite a wealthy man, that he is anti-elite and that politics has failed. And that's very like Trump. We want somebody different, not part of the elite, Democrats, Republican. We want an insurgent. But what the media plays into this, as they did with Trump, is that he is good copy. He does, drink pints, smoke cigarettes. Not sure he does that anymore. And he provides this kind of affable toad of Toll Hall persona. And they absolutely failed to scrutinize his policies. He wants to replace the NHS, to privatize, making weird sounds of people about kids with special needs in these local authorities. And and they've given the BBC's given a platform. The whole story is resurgent Farage. Whereas the Greens is a different story. Lib Dems are actually the third biggest party. Reform has, 5 MPs? Is it 4? Depends how many people have rebelled. And it is this politainment, as Otto English, our regular writer, which is the scourge of populism, because everything that Nigel Farage has done has failed. I mean, he really failed in the European Parliament. He only turned up rarely. Brexit, a huge disaster. And I think the interesting thing is, how much is it really just as Adam writes brilliantly about, this constant populism which has nibbled away at the Conservatives? Will it nibble away to Labour? And what's the best antidote to that kind of populism? Is it more the Canada, Carney, and you fight these things and you tell the truth? And the media kind of enables this gamified politics. It is kind of almost screaming Lord Such the way they deal with him. And because he's never in power, he can't say he's done anything wrong, but he's the main promulgator of Brexit. The press still refused. James O'Brien is one of the exceptions. Do you remember we did this whole podcast, the 5 questions that nobody will ask Nigel Farage about his Russian connections? One of the most egregious is Aaron Banks, his funder, the biggest donor in British political history, gave £8 million to the Leave EU campaign, nearly got in Bristol. It's on the court record, these multiple undisclosed meetings with the Russian embassy. People fear to tread in those areas, and it all becomes kind of down the pub, kind of celebrity politainment.
I think there's real parallels here, Peter, with how the media treated Boris Johnson in the run-up to him becoming Prime Minister, particularly when he was Mayor of London. It was kind of, like you say, politainment, pictures of him on a zip wire. The constant story was about his rival with David Cameron, all about personalities. But there was very little scrutiny about what he was actually doing as Mayor of London and what he actually wanted to do with the country. And the result, as we now know, was a disastrous premiership. His role in leading us to Brexit, Partygate, etc., etc. And I do think we're sort of repeating the same mistakes again, or the media is repeating the same mistakes again when it comes to Farage. All of the focus on him as a personality, swilling pints, and what he means for the Conservative Party, whether there's going to be a coalition. There probably isn't going to be a coalition, rather than what he would actually do if he becomes Prime Minister, by whatever means he does become Prime Minister.
I think the question of entertainment rather than political scrutiny is at the heart of this, isn't it? As you say, Peter, he is good copy. Quite a few commentators have observed and in fact enumerated the amount of times he appeared on Question Time relative to, for example, Carla Denyer, the leader of the Green Party, even though the Greens have had identical, or at some occasions superior, parliamentary representation compared to Reform or Farage in his various guises in the past.
There's a cultural cringe from the establishment, I think, always has been around Brexiteers. They feel that they're too elitist and Nigel Farage is a man of the people. Nigel Farage is only a man of the people if you're a BBC controller. I mean, what we have to acknowledge, though, and I think it's important as we get on to Labour, there is massive disaffection. I mean, a lot of that is historic because of the pandemic, also the parlous state the Conservatives left the country in with a huge borrowing and the catastrophe of Liz Truss. And I think it's interesting, I don't have more detailed analysis, where reforms seem to be stronger is obviously gobbling up the more right-wing Conservative votes. They seem to be filling the blue wall, the sort of more home counties, slightly more liberal One Nation Conservatives, and the old blue-collar red wall, particularly in places like Lincolnshire. They don't seem to have done so well in the northeast. Maybe there's better Labour organisation. But that sort of, forgive me if I call it the Brexity heartland, and a lot of those places, we always talk about it, have deindustrialised. They've been left behind. They feel betrayed originally by Brussels. Now it's Westminster. And I don't think we can just, we have to scrutinise Farage because he'll never be Prime Minister. Who's funding him? Who owns that party? It's just one of the weirdest sort of pop-up parties you can imagine. But we have to look at, why old Labour voters are leaving Labour. There's a cultural thing, I think, please overplayed. Or they're all woke. The red Labour hates the woke metropolitan elites. I'm not sure it's so much about that. The weird thing about reform is economically, it's very left wing. It's very interventionist, state support. We did a whole project with Clive Lewis, who has this water mutualisation bill, and we had a whole current edition has a whole thing about water and not nationalisation, mutualisation. Who was really keen on that? Who wanted to meet Clive Lewis about that? Richard Tice. So there is something in the sort of, if you like, the rejection of globalization and neoliberalism that I think they are legitimately capturing partly on the cultural side, but I think maybe Labour, this is their long-term strategy, whether they have enough time, I don't know, is to get those people back on board by improving their living conditions. One more brief thing is that we sent people to these meetings, the council hustings and things like that, and actually, a few want to talk about Islam and immigration, but a lot of those voters who turned up at this meeting were complaining about potholes or hospitals or schools, and there is a base of dissatisfaction. Our front page, if I haven't got it here, the simmer of discontent, which I think Farage taps into.
Yeah,
well, I've been speaking
Sorry.
to Luke Drill, who is a pollster who works for More in Common, and who conducts focus groups around the country, and has spent a lot of time speaking to sort of reform-curious Labour voters, and people have switched from Labour to Reform. And although immigration and asylum does come up a lot in those conversations, what comes up equally, if not more so, is dissatisfaction about economic dissatisfaction, and particularly dissatisfaction about some of the benefit cuts that we've seen. So the recent cuts to PIP, to personal independence payments for disabled people, and the winter fuel payments. And you saw that again in Runcorn on the doorstep. Labour campaigners saying what came up again and again was about the winter fuel payments. This idea that Labour was meant to be different from the Conservative Party, and that's what people have been hearing on the doorstep in a lot of these seats, is that we thought that you were going to be different from the Tories, and you haven't been. You're doing exactly the same cut. So although a lot of what the media is focusing now is immigration, Labour has to have a tougher immigration policy and all the rest of it. Not to say that these things aren't important, but actually these are arguments that are very hard for a Labour government and a Labour Party to win. Whereas an argument on the economy and a record of actually improving the economy and improving living standards for people, that is a winning argument for Labour. That is something that people are more inclined to believe that Labour are better on in the first place. So I think a focus on that from Labour was much more likely to lead to a second term at the end of this process than simply doing what the Conservatives have done, which is simply to say, well, the Farage, he may be right about immigration, but please don't vote for him anyway. He's completely right about this, but don't vote for him. And that has been a disastrous strategy from the Conservatives, as we can see in these local election results. If the Labour Party attempts something similar, a similar argument to people leaving their own party for reform, that's going to be similarly disastrous, I think, in the coming years.
Yeah, well, and we've talked about this on a fair few occasions on recent episodes of the podcast. And in fact, we interviewed on the most recent episode Clive Lewis, who talked about Labour's need, in his view, for a kind of a left-wing populism. A lot of people on the left of the Labour Party would share a similar analysis about the failures of neoliberalism as many reform voters. It hasn't worked for them. Yet, ironically, the leadership of the Labour Party has moved to the right, and particularly on those areas around immigration. It's wanted to out-reform, reform. And again, an observation that I've made and others have made on the podcast is that, and I think you've made it, Adam, is why would people who are tempted to vote for reform, why would they vote for reform light if that's what Labour is seen to be, when you can have the real thing? So Labour may, at some level, and people in the Labour Party may understand some of the weaknesses of neoliberalism, as does Nigel Farage, I think, as did Boris Johnson. But the answer isn't more of the same, isn't to go down the same route.
Well, yeah, they went into these elections campaigning on closing asylum hotels, saying they did not deny citizenship for asylum seekers, doing exactly what you're suggesting, really, a sort of reform-light approach. And that was tested to destruction by the Conservative Party with the Stop the Boats message. Ultimately, nobody believed they were going to stop the boats, apart from the fact that it was impossible to do. So they've gone for the why go for reform light when you can go for the real thing, and that's the Conservative Party tested that to destruction. There are signs that Labour are trying to do the same thing as well. I mean, we're still a long way out from the general election. They can shift position, but so far, this strategy, which is being described as sort of blue Labour or hard Labour strategy by Starmer's advisors, I would say is pretty much the opposite of the correct strategy that the party should be taking.
Can I make a point? I think Adam's completely right on that. And the thing is about credibility. People are looking for authenticity. I mean, Farage and Trump provide a level of authenticity because they're not sort of constrained in how they speak. They feel natural. I wish they were more constrained sometimes. And there is, a sense that Labour, by pretending to be more reform-like, just loses more credibility. It doesn't look authentic. Nobody believes that the majority Labour MPs believe this stuff, nor the core support. And it's not just the left. I mean, it's the centre-left. It's people like Neil Lawson and Cunfus. It isn't, Corbynites who are dissatisfied with that. So how's the public going to believe it? So I'd love to know, if only they talk to us, the inner strategy, what that polling they're doing, around Morgan McSweeney, where they think this is going to work. Because I think they've taken a false cue from the 90s. And what happened, obviously, Blairism, you had these consistent defeats of Kinnock, before that, Michael Foot, and they triangulated. And basically what they did is keep some Labour policies but appeal to, especially the working class who voted for Thatcher. Their aspirational nature, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, classic Gordon Brown statement, stolen by Tony Blair, which expresses both the liberal and the kind of slightly more conservative view. Now, you cannot triangulate around lies. Populism, Farage doesn't mean what he said. When you triangulate around Thatcherism, they had sold council houses. They've gone to war against the Falklands in Argentina, for the Falklands. There was a sense there was a coherent set of policies, which, if you like them or not, were being delivered. Privatisation, which Labour had to work around and sort of gain, as Macmillan had to work around Attlee and sort of, NHS and council housing. So you can't triangulate around Nigel Farage because there's a slippery piece of foam. It's like to wrestle with a frog. I'm not making analogies of toe-to-toe hall. It's just, they will just leap somewhere else. And I just fail to see, hopefully they'll see this experiment has gone wrong. I do, that this has not worked so far. And there's no sign, as Adam puts it brilliantly, it didn't work for the Tories. Why would it work for Labour?
I think what they're banking on, they're from their perspective, is that by the time we come to the next general election, that it will be, you see how the Conservative Party are collapsing in these local election results, that by the time of the next general election, it will be a battle between Labour and Reform. That's what they believe. Whether or not that turns out to be the case, it's too far away to say, but that's what they believe. And they think at that point, left-leaning voters are going to have nowhere else to go. So are they going to stick with the Labour Party, or are they going to allow Reform to get in? Now, that may or may not work, but it's a very big gamble to be taking. And it depends upon you actually having a record by that point that is worth defending. If we get to the end of that process and people don't feel that their lives have got better, whether or not they're scared of things that Nigel Farage has said in the past or his associations, those things may have more salience if people believe that Labour have actually improved their lives. If they don't believe that Labour has improved their lives, they're not going to care less about any of that stuff, and they're just going to take a roll of the dice and see if Farage is going to be any better.
Also, there are other places for them to go. The Green vote. You had you've got the Lib Dems, and if you look at it, it's not as polarized as America. The hardcore vote for Reform probably maxes out about 25%, because that's the problem with the coalition, isn't it, Adam? A lot of Conservatives hate Farage; they don't like what he's done, and they're more likely to go Lib Dem. So the idea that it would be a face-to-face with Farage, like a 50-50, and nowhere else to go. Look, they seem to know what they're doing. They could boast they won the last election with a landslide, sure, but it was, and we all know, a vote against the Tories and their catastrophic 15 years in power. I just think they're misreading the majorities here.
Interesting comment coming in from Claire Hartnell. And if you do want to join in on the chat, feel free to do so. Claire says, I'm perplexed that no one sees the three key events: trade deficits, late 90s onwards, net energy importer from 2004, banking collapse and government debt from 2008. In Claire's opinion, populism was inevitable. She says people want change.
Well, the problem is that is completely true, and definitely Trump and Farage feed off that sense that neoliberalism, which was neither very liberal or that new, has failed. And it has. Globalization is creaking, and its economic sense, particularly in these countries, wages are flatlined. The thing is, who's going to deliver you real outcomes? And, I have so many criticisms of this Labour government, which I share a lot with Adam, but they are competent. They're not corrupt, not to the same level as the Tories. They're not constantly changing their leader. They're quite a steady ship, even if you don't like the kind of general direction. populism we saw. I hope we'd be inoculated. Johnson and Truss went, oh, it's not working. The blob, Europe, and they threw it up in the air. All these millions, billions of crony contracts, and we were left with borrowing 100% of GDP. It's yes, dissatisfaction with a classic Brexit. You have a headache. What are you going to do? Shoot yourself in the foot with Brexit? Made the headache worse. Maybe distracted you from your headache. Should get Farage back. That's the second headache. But I think you're right. Nobody's really thinking of those key causes. Maybe this drift to Blue Labour, which is more interventionist, does address some of that, but it comes at a cost because Blue Labour is very culturally exclusive.
I think a big part of the dissatisfaction and the collapsing support for the Conservative Party over recent years is that they often seem to have their sort of natural voters hold them in contempt, particularly in their sort of southern heartland lands, sort of more liberal kind of centre ground Conservatives. I think particularly under Badenoch, but also under Sunak and Truss, hold them in contempt. I think the Labour Party is at risk of a similar of appearing to have a similar contempt. A lot of this sort of hard Labour or Blue Labour rhetoric is kind of implicit in that, is that their own supporters, their own natural sort of metropolitan, more liberal, socially liberal, left-leaning voters are a bit soft. They're not really in touch with real people. They're not real voters. And so there's always this focus on this sort of narrow band of sort of reform-curious voters from both the Conservative Party and from the Labour Party, while ignoring the sort of mass of voters in the centre who are not on those extremes. And I think that didn't work for the Conservative Party. I don't think it's going to work for Labour either.
Can I just make one point of that? Because I do encounter these people, and there's a lot of former Labour writers, people I've worked with who drifted to this kind of pro-reform Blue Labour right. They always seem to be quite posh. They're the posh ones. You and me, Adam, at state school. I know I sound posh. That's just a bit of Cambridge on top. They all went to private school. Oh, the working people really need this. You metropolitan elite. It's always the Richard Tices of this world with their millions and his partner in Dubai who are always going about elites. And I think you're right that there is a misreading of the populace. I mean, you make the analogy with London, don't you, Adam? Sadiq Khan's strategy, you could look at Carney's strategy in Canada. There is a mainstream progressive coalition if someone wants to build it.
Yeah,
I think. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, and it's, I think where the Blue Labour sort of strategy, if you like, does have a point is it's focused on patriotism. And I think patriotism is important in politics. I think it's important to look like you actually like the country that you want to lead. I think that's a big part of the problem that the Conservative Party have got at the moment, is that Kemi Badenoch doesn't look like she particularly likes modern Britain. And a lot of Conservatives don't look like modern Britain. I think the slight weakness that Keir Starmer has got at the moment is he hasn't mobilised that patriotism in regards to Trump in the way that Carney mobilised it to great success in the recent Canadian elections. And I think, while I understand Starmer's strategy on Trump and, being pragmatic and trying to get the best deal he possibly can, I think there was a bit of a missed opportunity there to at least try and tap into what is really a sort of deeply anti-Trump sentiment in the British public.
Can I ask you something? Can I ask Adam something on that? While all this is going on and this stupid thing about, being tough on migrants and let alone the disability cuts, there is another move going on that seems to be, I'm not sure I've read it right, but, closer to Europe, thanks partly to the abandonment of Trump. The good thing, I feel, in a way, Starmer, is your idea that they'll have to stay with us, we'll be against reform. That's our Macron strategy, which didn't really work for Macron, right? Mm-hmm. But him and Macron have sort of come out as sort of leaders in Europe. I wonder if there's a split here between, the kind of high voltage media policy of these sort of announcements, just like stop the boats. What's going on in international affairs? And then, like Sadiq Khan, what's actually going on the ground? Andy Burnham, there's lots of... Labour isn't just Keir Starmer and Morgan McSweeney. There's a whole movement there.
Yeah, I think
there's such control from the top, isn't there? And I reference in all my broadcasts at the moment the brilliant book Get In by Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund, which explains the power of Morgan McSweeney and the drivers behind Keir Starmer ideologically. One of those is the vote for the Labour Party for Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. And there were a lot of Labour MPs who wanted to abstain on that vote. Starmer and the rest of the Labour Party whipped Labour MPs into voting for it because they wanted the party to appear statesmanlike and acting in the national interest. I think 37 Labour MPs abstained, but the majority of them voted for Johnson's Brexit deal because they wanted to appear to be acting in the national interest. And at that point, Starmer said, that's it, Brexit is done. And whenever he's approached by it, there's always this argument, we don't want to relitigate Brexit. But as Clive Lewis said to me the other day, the circumstances have changed. Even if that was a logical position to take 2 years ago, well, we now have the full-scale invasion of Ukraine since 2022 by Putin. We now have Trump in the White House, who has no interest in maintaining the United States' traditional protective umbrella, it would seem to me, over Western Europe. Times have changed. And I think that if you go to the British people with a different argument that says times have changed, then the grounds for a different relationship with Europe are there.
Absolutely, and I think you're completely right there, Adrian. I think at the time of the voting for the Brexit deal, whatever you think of Brexit, whether there was a clear logic for that position. The Labour Party was really suffering at that time because of the divide in the vote on Brexit. The 2020 general election victory for Boris Johnson was in part because of that realignment of the Brexit vote. We're in a very different position now. And for all that Keir Starmer says that, we mustn't make a false distinction, a choice between being close to America and being close to EU, reality has to intrude here. And the reality is that our future is with Europe. We have our biggest trading partner is in Europe. They are reliable. The Trump administration and America under Trump is deeply unreliable. We're desperate for more economic growth. The economy has been flatlining for the last 14, 15 years. There are not many options open to a Labour government to turn that around. One of the only options they've got is a closer economic relationship with Europe, which is much easier to achieve than a closer economic relationship with America for all kinds of reasons. So I do think that reality, at some point, whatever Starmer is saying now, will intrude. And I do think we are going to end up with that closer relationship. And there are some early signs that the government does realise that, including on the young people exchange situation that is currently being heavily considered by the Home Office at the moment.
Can I just add one thing? What I notice is happening, it's happening across the political spectrum from left to right, is this belief that we're in a post-liberal time. That's what Glassman, Gray, Goodwin, Goodhart, this very well written about in our book by John Bloomfield and David Edgar, whose name escapes me. It's a byline book, but it'll come back. We'll put it in the chat. And you see that, I think, the editorship of the New Statesman, Jason Cowley and John Gray, who's this kind of philosopher friend, think we're in a post-liberal time. Europe is a unique institution. It's rule-based and a voluntary kind of combination of nations. It's not an empire. It's not being invaded like Greenland or Canada by America would be, or Ukraine by Russia. So we're talking about a rules-based liberal system. That's why I hate the term neoliberalism, which I always say is not that new and not that liberal, because that was bankers overcoming the rules, the sort of natural rules, the patriotism of the nation state. And in that patriotism, you can have rule-based organizations joining together voluntarily, like the EU. And I do think the EU will occupy a crucial role in the years ahead. And that's why whatever Starmer says, it's not just reality, it's gravity. It's geography.
But there's also, Peter, sorry to cut across you there, but there's also something self-denying here, isn't there? Because none of the major parties, well, I exclude the Lib Dems actually from that criticism, but none of them, the main Westminster parties, has wanted to discuss Brexit. Actually, that is one of the most ready sticks with which to beat Farage should you choose to take him down from the wall, because we have suffered demonstrable economic damage as the result of a referendum that he masterminded. Well, in any other political scenario, you would be saying, you have caused us economic harm unquestionably, that has been agreed by academics across, and of course we have always then have the argument, oh, it wasn't the right Brexit, whatever that might be. But there is this self-denying ordinance, both amongst Labour and Conservative leaders, a refusal to condemn the key policy that Farage has brought.
That's a brilliant point, Adrian. I can completely agree. And it's not just consensus among academics and experts. It's a consensus among voters, including even among Reform voters. Reform voters who they may not say that they regret their vote for Brexit, but if you ask them how Brexit is doing, most Reform voters will say it's going really badly. So I think there is a real big opportunity for the Labour Party to make that case, to go on the attack against Farage and say, look at the damage you have done, rather than pretending that we're, to use the Labour slogan, that we're going to make Brexit work. You cannot make Brexit work. You have to make the relationship with the EU work. Whether or not that means going back into the EU completely, or whether it means re-entering the customs union or some other deal that we managed to strike with the EU, you have to make that relationship work. Brexit has not worked, and it will not work, and the country knows it.
I think the really good point, Adam, is that, they are, the BBC, all the afraid to relitigate those culture wars which emerged when over 4 years elected Boris Johnson. And I'm going to use, rather than the B word, the F word, right? Can you bear this? The future. So we
worried there for a moment, Peter.
I thought I'd get you on the edge. A little bit of catfishing there. The F word, the future. In the look, I have the same attitude to Russian interference. I've done a whole podcast, people might know, Carol Walder, about Russian interference in British politics. I'm not saying we go back and undo Brexit because the Russians interfered. What I'm saying is, how do you look to the future? How do you secure elections? Make sure it's not China next time or Iran influencing each other. And likewise, I think Brexit, whatever, it didn't work. What's our future relationship? And it's because the media, who mainly created Brexit, are obsessed. Oh, they're backtracking. All this kind of weird sort of, as you say, the Brexit, it's like communism, it's not really communism yet. And were you a true believer in Brexit? It didn't happen because you didn't believe enough. And we just go, and I think maybe there's an element in Starmer's foreign policy, which just slowly, steadily, yes, gravity take hold. What's our future relationship with the EU, which itself may change, may take Ukraine in it, new associate status. Somehow we've got to get beyond fighting the past that can't change to claiming a future that can.
As I'm reporting here, again, the local election results are coming in as we speak, so it's a moving picture, but Reform have gained, remember I say right from the start, this was from a standing start, they've gained 529 local council seats. The Conservatives have lost 516, dwarfing the 137 that Labour have lost. And Peter, we speak fairly often on the podcast and we read the writings in the Byline Times of Peter Oborne, a Conservative, because the Byline Times is not partisan politically. We do not stand for any one political party. Peter represents a strand of what people might regard as noble conservatism, of patriotic one nation conservatism. People like Peter, who would be inclined to vote Conservative, really have nowhere to go, do they? Oh, well, maybe Blue Labour. I don't know.
No, I don't think they would go
not the Conservative Party.
No, and he's joined by Michael Heseltine, by Dominic Grieve, David Gore. Dominic Grieve. There was a whole raft of One Nation Conservatives. When you talk to them, saw their job was to take some of that right-wing anger and diffuse it and have more rational policies. And this is a global thing, isn't it? I think back to your caller's point about the collapse of our economic model. The Tories are very associated with the Anglo-Saxon laissez-faire, call it neoliberalism if you like, and that has collapsed, and that's what Trump is a response to. And so where does the centre-right across Europe, across America go? It tends to be going, you have Le Pen in France, you have the AfD in Germany, you have Meloni, and whatever, I always forget the name, in Italy. You have, and if you look at the AfD vote, it's all East Germany, where they feel left behind, where they feel poorer. I don't know what Adam thinks, but it is like the real victim of this, whatever Labour's response, is the centre-right.
Well, at the moment, they seem to be going to the Liberal Democrats. Liberal Democrats having a clean sweep in some parts of the country that have long been held by the Conservatives. I don't think there has been enough focus on that shift to the Lib Dems. I don't think it is just a simple sort of protest vote. You can describe it as a protest vote when you actually are protesting against the government, the party in government. When you're protesting against the party in opposition, I think it goes beyond the protest vote to something.
We'll end in a few moments' time because I know people have got various commitments. I just throw a comment here from Eva Delaney says, I don't think Farage is ever sufficiently challenged, which is a point I think you both made earlier. I'll just vote to keep reform out. Before that, it was to keep the Tories out. Now it's Blue Labour. Lucky me, says Eva. And that does point to, I think, a structural flaw in our election system. I don't think there is any such thing as a perfect electoral system, but I think the fracturing of our political parties now does highlight the weaknesses of first past the post, and the choice that somebody like Eva has, which is almost always to vote for the least bad candidate rather than the candidate that they would like to vote for.
Well, we saw in the mayoral elections in these local elections. These elections previously were held under a more proportional system, but that was scrapped by the last Conservative government who moved it towards first past the post. There was an opportunity for Labour after entering government to reverse that process in the similar way to Conservatives reversed some of the constitutional changes that Labour had made. And they chose not to do so. Now, you look at somewhere like the West of England mayoralty, where the vote is split between 5 different parties, and you had a situation where actually Reform's Aaron Banks came relatively close to winning that, and he would have won on the basis of a quarter of the vote. Whereas if that had been held under the old system, there likely would have been the votes would have been reassigned among the other left-leaning, centre-left parties, and he would have been kept out. Now, you can look at other parts of the country where the opposite may be the case, but it's clearly not a democratic situation where you have somebody elected to a position on the basis of 25% of the vote. And first past the post was a system that was set up when you had 2 big, strong parties, and it kind of works in creating a majority for one of those 2 parties. When you have a sort of multi-parties situation, as we currently do, and as these local elections show, it's just no longer a sustainable system. But of course, none of the governing parties ever want to change this situation because it does benefit them, and that's what the reason that Labour did get such a big landslide on a relatively low proportion of the vote last year is because of that system.
And the other thing, we talked with Peter Oborne about this. What he basically says is, because at the festival 2 years ago, last year he said, the centre-right was dead. And why is that, right? And why is all this happening? You have these multiple parties. Because we don't have mass parties anymore, and the parties are owned by donors, right? So he makes the point that Labour refused to cap the donations under pressure from Lord Ali, reportedly, to that book, Get In. You can see if one tracks the donors behind Farage and the Conservative Party, they'll follow where the money goes, because you don't have this mass membership, 1 million people joining, them paying their subs and funding their party. It's a few rich men, nearly invariably men. And that's the part of the turbulence of this, is that we no longer have mass member parties. We have this highly charged media landscape and donors coming along, swooping in. Aaron Banks giving 8 million to Leave EU and making such a big difference.
Yeah, the left lane, by the way, says socialists have no party to vote for. Let's get PR done. It's interesting. One of the reasons why PR has been opposed, I think, by many people in this country hitherto, is that there's a fear that it would open the door to the far right in this country. Some people might say that door has already been kicked down and is wide open at the moment.
Well, that was one of the points that John Curtis made today about these results, is that first past the post is now working for Reform. These results are a victory for first past the post for Nigel Farage and the Reform Party. It's the complete opposite of the situation it's been in the past. It'd be interesting to see whether Reform actually drop their support for PR system on that basis.
Indeed. Listen, it's been great to have this conversation on the Byline Supplement. I know we'll do it again, and we'll do it frequently. Thank you to Adam Bienkov, the Byline Times political editor. Thanks to Peter Jukes, the Byline Times executive editor. I'm Adrian Goldberg. You'll be able to listen to an edited version of this broadcast on the Byline podcast. And before we go, just to remind you that powering all of this is our wonderful monthly news periodical edited by Hardeep Matharu. Peter's holding a copy up there of the Byline Times. So do consider taking out a subscription if you can. It's very, very good value, and it powers all of our work here. You can also take out a paid subscription to the Byline Supplement as well if you're feeling generous. But head over to our newsbreaking website, bylinetimes.com. That's bylinetimes.com, and you'll get details of how to subscribe there. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Peter. We'll see you again soon.
Bye.
Bye now.